But you probably noticed we have a guest. I really want to thank everybody for coming. So, that light's for Father. No, I want to thank everybody for coming, and as I said, I want to thank Father Ripperger for being here. It's such an honor to have him. I'm going to repeat a little bit what I said in Mass tonight, but Father Ripperger has been a friend and a mentor of mine for some time in the deliverance and exorcism world. He's a great theologian, a philosopher. He's an author. He's written a number of books. I have a number of them. One of them is his book on psychology that's this big. It's the intro to psychology. So it's really good. And then he's just come out here recently, one of them not quite out, his books on deliverance ministry, one for laity, one for priests. And just as a way, and he didn't ask for this, I asked to be able to do it, but he doesn't kind of want to have books back there in the marketplace. But if you want to, it's centradpress.com. You can buy anything you want there. It's SENTRAD press.com. Father, obviously, as most of you know, is a renowned exorcist. He's a trainer of exorcists, and that's how I mostly got to know him. There's a funny little story. I don't know if any people will really get this. One of the first times we had dinner was at a particular restaurant, and the waiter came up and he asked, what do you want to drink? And so we're ordering a burger or whatever. And I asked the waiter to list what they had, and he did. And he said, Angels Envy. I said, I love Angels Envy. And Father goes, really? So, anyway, you live and learn, right? Father is the founder of a society called the Catholic Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother. He is originally from Casper, Wyoming. He has multiple degrees. I don't know because I haven't asked Father how many languages he speaks, and I'm not going to put him on the spot. But you know the old joke about what do you call somebody who speaks several languages? They're called a polyglot, right? What do you call somebody who speaks two languages? Bilingual, right? What do you call somebody who speaks one language? American. The Father has 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, a doctorate in philosophy, and in his spare time he just pretty much eats bonbons and watches soap operas. So, but as I also said, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, you know, you think about somebody who's, let's say, a parent of a middle schooler in sports, or maybe football or something, and maybe that parent used to play football back in the day or something. That parent, of course, knows everything there is to know about football, right? They're just that way sometimes. But then, if you look at a Peyton Manning or somebody that's like way up here, there's no pride in them whatsoever, right? You know, those are some of you know him. They're just kind and they're humble, and they don't have to be a big deal, right? They just are. Well, in the spiritual world, in the world of philosophy and theology and exorcism, that's the category I put Father Ripperger in. You know, there's those who think they're all holy and theological and smart and all that, and they want to kind of show it. And then there's Father. And the greater someone is, I think, the more humble they tend to be, and that certainly applies to Father. So with that, again, thank you for coming, Father. Thank you for being here. Father Chad Ripperger.
As you can see, I'm really challenged. Brother says, you know, I have humility. It's so funny because I was telling him about how I have this app, and they mislabeled humidity for humility. And so one day it was 98%. I took a snapshot, I sent my friends, and I said, hush. I didn't tell fathers, the next day it was down to 25%. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations and carried on by thy gracious assistance with every prayer and report we give from thee, and by your canon through Christ our Lord. Amen. Virgin most powerful. Pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So the topic of this conference is what is spiritual warfare and how can we see what's going on around us. So I want to take a little bit off of what I mentioned during the homily, which is, after Adam and Eve fell, we all are now in this spiritual battle, whether we like it or not. We've all been drafted, we've all been conscripted, whether we like it or not. And so it's a real reality that all of us deal with with diabolic influence to some degree in our lives. Now, varying people have very different degrees of that influence. And so tomorrow I'm going to talk about what that battlefield actually looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about some of it today. But tomorrow I'm going to go into the 5 different ways of extraordinary diabolic influence and what we see in the more extreme side of the complexion of the battlefield is somewhat reflective in actually the stuff that we do with day to day. The demons are extraordinarily consistent. In fact, for us, they seem random. They seem like they just all of a sudden, boom, out of nowhere, they're attacking this and that. But in point of fact, they are probably the most regulated and most consistent beings in the entire universe. And it's interesting because you see this even in solemn session when you're doing exorcisms, that there comes a certain point where they don't always have to obey the exorcist, although most of the time they do. But whenever God tells them to do X, there is never, ever any question, there's never a fight, there's never a delay. They do it immediately. And why is that? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, especially this authority structure that we have in our minds. As I mentioned, God put in our minds part of the natural laws, technically speaking, part of the third category of natural inclination, which is that category that's proper to us as rational human beings, right? And so this includes things like pursuit of the truth, that God is to be obeyed, St. Thomas says in his earlier works. It's interesting because it's missing in some of his later works. But God is to be obeyed, living in community, living in actually having government. Well, I do tell people it's supposed to be small, not as big as it seems to be. It seems to be getting bloated as time goes on, which is contrary to the principle of subsidiarity, so, which reason just naturally go. Government should be where it needs to be. Right? But there's all sorts of aspects of this part of that, the truth is to be pursued, etc. But part of that is that the demons, like human beings, God infused them at the time of their creation. He infused in them their very nature, who and what they are. So there were several things that He infused in them when they were created. This is true of the angels, too, the good angels. He infused in them who He is, what their relationship to Him is, what their assigned task, which for each angel is its own nature. Each angel literally is essentially different from every other angel. And you can tell it during sessions because when the demons manifest, their personalities are far, far more distinct than human personalities. What their assigned task is that God was asking of them. What would happen if they didn't do it? What would and the general fallout eventually that was going to happen from that. So in the first instance of their creation, they immediately saw the totality of that instantaneously. Angels do not think things through. They immediately know them because they have all the essences of everything that's ever been created in their minds at the time of their creation. So if they want to know what the essence of human being is, they just have to look at it in their mind, and they exhaust everything there is to know about that instantaneously. It's actually a great diagnostic tool because in session, one of the ways that you can tell that the person's faking, rather than the person being truly possessed, if it's diabolical, ask them questions that's a little complex theologically or philosophically, what have you, and the demons will just say, no, it's this. That's it. Because they know it instantaneously, you just have to think of it. They know it. It's the same thing. They know all languages that have ever existed. And so that's why they can speak just about anything. Christ, whatever. But then, if it's a human being and they're faking, you ask them a question like, sorry, there's nothing here, right? Okay. So, there's some other issues. So when this was all created, there were these first 3 instances St. Thomas talks about, and after that there's a series. They're not in time, and what's called the age, which is, it's not a measure of time. The definition of time is the measurement of motion of a physical thing which has a beginning and an end, right? Because we know that God created the world at a certain point, and time is going to end. Then there's what they call a deism, and that's a series of events that occur in the minds and in the wills of the angels, and also now those in heaven and those in purgatory. So there's a series of events that happen. And there's the first three of those, what they call the first three instances. The first instance is they were created instantaneously with this full and absolute complete comprehension, and part of that was the authority structure that God had determined was going to be put in place, both in angelic nature and also in human nature. So that we personally, as human beings, know what that structure is by the natural law. That's why the church calls itself the expert in human nature, the natural law. That's why John Paul II spent a lot of time talking about the natural law. In fact, he said probably one of the most important things theologically, and it was kind of a blip on most people's radar, but he said the church takes the Thomistic teaching of the natural law as its own. Into its own. Very key statement, because what he's saying is that how St. Thomas understood the natural law in human beings and in angels is actually the foundation for the church's understanding of the natural law, but because it takes it into its own, the church's natural understanding of natural law is more developed. Okay, which is true. Okay, that all being said, they have this authority structure in their mind. So there's that first instance. When they saw that, they saw how absolutely beautiful God's plan was, the order of creation, his reflection in them, how beautiful he was, how good he was, all of that instantaneously they saw that. And as a result of that, St. Thomas says, concomitantly in their wills was an immediate delight that they saw in that. This is one of the things that you can actually be deans of in session. You force them to think about the delight of their first instance. It brings them to their knees. Because that's the one time that they got to actually take delight in all of that. Then they make their choice. They're not like human beings. See, the reason that God actually has mercy with us as human beings is he doesn't have the angels, right? Because if they're faithful, they don't need mercy. And if they're unfaithful, well, their wills are fixed. I'll talk about here in a minute. Their will is fixed. And so they can't change. So recently, you've probably been hearing people say, oh, in the end, they might get an actual a second chance. That was actually condemned by the church. That idea that they would be rehabilitated in the end, that was actually formally condemned by a pope. But that all being said, so they had this thing that was presented to their choice. Now, in that process, and this is actually something which gives you a key in understanding the spiritual life. They saw that there was this, so they saw this was their assigned task, that their nature was proportionate to this task. But then it also meant that they saw goods that were above them, that weren't proper to their nature. And so it was presented to them, they saw those. And so their temptation ultimately was to see those good things and to choose to desire them or not. They knew they would never get them. They knew that. But they could choose to be attached to them. Or they could take that good that they saw was good and they could sacrifice it to God in order to perform the task that they were to perform. And then in that, if they made that choice to sacrifice that, that meant that in the third instance, they were immediately rewarded with the beatific vision. They saw God immediately. Then, those who fell, who decided, I'm not going to serve God, I want this thing that's above me. It's true, you're going to say what he wanted. There's something very specific he wanted. And when he saw that, he chose to have that, to want to have that. Literally, he chose to entertain the figment of his imagination over the reality that in mind. It's going to be one of the key things. When you see a culture or society or people even in the church where there's this shift, where people become more and more disconnected from reality and are living in these constructs in their head, that's a sign that the diabolic has taken over to some degree. I'll talk more about that as we go along. But when they saw that, once they made that choice to not serve God and they wanted to hold on to this thing, they were immediately damned. So they immediately experienced the pain of loss. That they were never going to see God, remorse of conscience. There's actually 13 different things that cause demons pain to think about. So once they did that, but it never left that God infused in their mind the essence of the authority structure and his understanding that God had said, this is the authority structure, this is what you must obey. From that point on, so even though they really got to make their one choice, from that point on, they must follow this authority structure to the letter. They cannot act outside of that authority structure at all. What does that mean concretely? It means that if they get to attack you, it's a sign of one of two things. The first is that God has to permit them. If they're bound by the authority structure, they cannot do anything at all without God giving that permission. I'll give you an example. So there's one who was possessed, and one of the possessors was possessing the lower part of her back. So at a certain point, I commanded him to tell us the story of the possessing the lower part of the back. And he said, I don't know. By the way, when I talk about it colloquially, there's actually a very formal structure in this session. But I'm just breaking it, summarizing it in a colloquially. I said, what do you mean you don't know? He said, I don't know. All I know is that when I entered, Christ restricted me to this part of the body. What kind of manifestations would he able to? When he can attack the person who's possessed? Whether he can do things like levitation, changing shape, using different languages, which languages he can use. What kind of discussion he can even have with the exorcist, what he can reveal to the exorcist, and when. All of that is absolutely, completely determined by Christ. This is very important because of why this authority structure, they must obey him, and he's laid out the whole thing. This is how this is going to work. Why did he do that? But the second reason that demons are allowed in your life. And the second is that God allows them. But the second one is because the demons are our means of sanctification. There's two parts to this. One is that we're instruments of their justice, right? They have to deal with us, but every time they get defeated by us, or we defeat them in a temptation, or we do something good, they get humiliated and brutally beat around. One time I had this dream, and I don't pay much attention to dreams, right? But this one kind of, so I'm getting a little bit, because I can tell it's diabolic. There's certain characteristics that they have, that diabolic dreams. And I walk into this room in the dream, and the person's sitting there in a chair, like, much like it is in session, and the assistants are standing around in the session, and they say, oh, it's a session, right? So I just take the book, I start saying the prayers of exorcism, and all of a sudden the demon manifests, in the dream. I grab him by the face, and I start slamming his face on the ground, the walls, the ceiling, and everything, and then when I'm done, I just throw him down, I wipe my hands, say, okay, we're done, and I just walk out. That's what they experience in a session. That's the brutality of it. You don't see that much of it, but there's a brutality that they experience in that, but they're completely controlled. Why? Because we are their instruments of their justice. God lets them get involved in holy people's lives precisely so that they get humiliated. In fact, Satan even said to me one time that God the Father goes out of his way to set him up to get humiliated. And this is a key thing to keep in mind. That they don't get to maraud and do whatever they want. It's true that in the letter of St. Peter, he says, be watchful, for there is a roaring lion going around seeking someone to devour. That's true. The problem is he's on this short leash, and Christ happens to be the one that's in control of it. It doesn't mean he's not going around, it's just Christ is letting him think of these things and watch us to see what it says, and then at certain points he's going to allow. But the other reason that demons can be in our lives is to chasten us, if we've done something wrong. Why? Well, remember when I was talking about in the homily that Adam and Eve stepped out from underneath the authority structure of God and stepped under the authority structure of Satan? It means the church used to talk about what they call the temporal punishment due to sin. What that basically means is there's the sin itself, which is in our will. We choose the evil thing. We know it's wrong. But then there's a series of cascading effects that result from that choice. Our faculties become more disordered, as I mentioned. The demons gain more power in our lives because you're doing something that empowers them. In fact, most people are unaware that if you end up damned, the demon that got you to commit that mortal sin for which you was damned, you're under him in hell. So you're placing yourself under them. And that through that authority, by committing that sin, you place yourself underneath their authority structure. And obviously they do not rule, they rule like tyrants. But you're placing yourself underneath that, and so as a result, these are things you're going to have to do to get back out from underneath it. And every mortal sin, and every venial sin, you place yourself under them to some degree. Now, mortal sin is a different kind of an animal. Most people, obviously, a mortal sin is someone who commits a grave offense against God. And by the way, so if you commit a mortal sin, you can become subject to diabolic influence, extraordinary diabolic influence. Not everybody who commits mortal sin does. In fact, the number of people who become possessed as a result of mortal sin is relatively low. In fact, statistically, it's probably less than 0.5% of the people who commit mortal sin on a regular basis. And a lot of that's just because God is merciful and doesn't let us suffer the effects of our sin, because if He did, we just get brutalized. But what most people don't realize is through a mortal sin, you are taking yourself out from underneath the structure of God and placing yourself underneath the authority structure of Satan, so that the proper effect of every mortal sin is possession. It doesn't mean that everybody that does that becomes possessed. Why? Because as exorcists, we call that mortal sin an open door, right? And so that open door, basically, you open up the door to let the demon in, but it's God who determines whether you can step up across the threshold. The demons are constantly trying to incite us to commit mortal sins and see which doors are open, to see which ones God's going to let them in. And this is one of the reasons why I tell people never, under any circumstance, commit sin whatsoever. Even in the past, they used to tell people, you should be ready, be willing to go to your death than to commit even a venial. So, it's just slight. You should be willing to go to your death. Today, you can commit mortal sin, it's going out of style, obviously. There's another part to this. So every time you do that, the temporal punishment due to your sins become more subject to diabolical influence. We see this with Adam and Eve. Now we're all stuck with this thing. We're all stuck in this spiritual warfare that we didn't choose, but here we are. And now that we're in it, the real question becomes, how am I going to respond to this thing? Am I going to act like the thing doesn't exist? The thing is, demons love that when you don't pay attention to them. They also love when you pay too much attention to them. So we see people that, that are constantly looking for every single thing. Satan's under a rock. No, he's not. He's under every other rock. And then you pick up a rock, he's not there. And you pick up another, it's not there. And then you go back to the other rock, and there you say, how did you get there? It's kind of that kind of thing. But they want you to become hyper-focused on them because there's a very essential principle among diabolic warfare, and it's this. Anything but God. Anything but God. That's their overarching principle, because they envy the good that we have. They envy the idea that we might get to see God face to face, and they will never see Him face to face. They envy us. But if anything by God, it means people can become, like for example, you'll see this from time to time, you'll see people who, they're doing everything for everybody in the church, they're claiming they're doing this for charity, and they spend, 40, 50 hours a week at church, and they've got 8 children at home. You're like, what are you doing? I'm serving God. No, you're not. Your job is to be at home. That's how you're serving God, is to follow His chosen state for your life. You will become over-focused. John the Cross even talks about how becoming attached, even to religious statuary and things of that sort, can itself be used by the demons against us. The other part of it is that this authority structure that the demons follow is based on the objective criteria. What does that mean concretely? It means this. If you commit a mortal sin objectively, even though subjectively you didn't realize what you were doing, or you were unaware that it was a grave matter, there are objective effects of that grave disorder, and that the domain of that grave disorder is the diabolic. I have seen people become possessed, committing a mortal sin that they didn't even know was mortal at the time. Why? Because demons work off the objective. You objectively have stepped out from underneath the authority structure. This is why this ignorance among Catholics is so dangerous. We'll see this later. One of the principal things you have to do to engage in spiritual warfare well is you have to know your faith well. It's not just a matter of, I had decent catechism, that's not good enough. You're going to have to know, especially as things get more complicated, more convoluted, even in the church. You've got to know what the church teaches. You know, when you hear the German bishops saying things like, we think women should become priests, you better know that that whole thing was put to rest by what a Nazi soldier taught us by John Paul II. So the point being is, there's certain things you just really need to know if you're going to be able to fight that black, because demons use deception. They're going to put stuff in your mind that is contrary to the Catholic faith. If you don't know well enough, you're going to just get sucked in. You're going to do something that opens the door to them because they work off the objective. And that conversely means that if you do something and you don't think, well, I didn't think it was more simple, it doesn't matter. Well, I don't feel it is, it doesn't matter. Oh, I don't believe it is, doesn't matter. God established an objective authority structure. He established an objective natural law and divine causal law. That's what we see in Scripture and in tradition. He set these things forward so that demons know the exact boundaries of that structure. And so if you don't follow that, you're going to end up off the rails. You're going to end up under diabolic influence at some point. It may not necessarily be extraordinary, but that's what you have to realize is that this is one of the reasons why it's so dangerous. But one of the other temporal punishments due to sin is this. Sin affects everybody else. But let's look at the converse. Think about this. If you were as holy as, say, St. Joseph or Padre Pio or Mother Teresa, or just even some of the more recent saints, let's say John of the Cross or Teresa, if you were that holy, look at the impact your prayers and your presence would have, but you're not. It tells you how much your own sin has impacted everyone else's ability to fight this battle. When we commit evils, we don't open up the door just to demons in our lives. If you're part of this authority structure, for example, a father, you open up the demons getting into your home, and it starts affecting your children. We call this generations, which gets passed from generation to generation. You also open it, you just give demons more access to the world in general. So now everyone's got to be dealing with this. And the more evil the people become, the harder it is for everyone else to lead just basic, decent lives. I'll give you an example. One of the things that we've known as exorcists for about the last 10 to 12 years is something that a phenomenon that we had never seen historically to our knowledge. Historically, Satanists and witches never had anything to do with each other. They hated each other. They didn't even like each other. And they all both considered themselves, they're doing one thing, but they're doing another, whatever they're doing, we don't really care, right? And you have to remember, for example, there's forms of witchcraft that have been, even Satanism, that have been in generational lines of families for 300 to 400 years. These people, these witches, some of these Satanists, are so knowledgeable about how is the diabolic, the angelic structure of grace, how all the supernatural mechanism works. They understand it almost on the same level that I do. That's how knowledgeable they are about this stuff because it's been in their families for generations. But then what happened? About 10 to 12 years ago, the Satanists and the witches started talking with each other, and they have become a highly organized. I'll just be clear. The people that are at the top of the heap in witchcraft and in Satanism, you will never know who they are. Never. They can be the people sitting next to you in the pew. They can be the judge. They can be the policeman who has an outstanding record. They can be in all positions, doctors, lawyers, the whole thing. They can be in positions that are very respected, and you would never know it. Why? Because they're doing things that are capital crimes, that's why. And it's a cult, it's hidden specifically. But they've all become, and so these people have become highly organized. The people that you see, like the hacks, I don't know if you recall, there's this guy in Oklahoma City who had stolen a host, right? He managed to get a host. He touted himself as a Satanist and all this, and he was out there. And I said, well, first of all, everybody just start ignoring the guy because he's just doing this to get attention. The second thing is he's a hack. He's a low-level Satanist. These really high-level Satanists are doing things that they could know, they could get put to death for by any just government. So they just nobody even knows this stuff. People have had Satanists in families for generations, and the children don't even know sometimes. That's how hidden this stuff is. There's other ways to ferret them out, but this is the point which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. This is one of the things that you'll actually see. That they become highly organized. And what we've discovered is they've been systematically forcing and doing rituals against the individual priests in their neighborhood, the bishops, the pope, the cardinals, all of them. They've been cursing these people. They've also been doing it systematically against government leaders that are on the side of the good and want the right things to be done. We also found out about 6 to 8 months ago that they've done something, we're not sure what it is, they've done something to empower the demons to start brutally attacking good Catholic families that were not being attacked. And this is something that, my whole point is not to give you this scary news. My whole point is that this stuff is highlighted. This is the world that we live in. Part of the reason, too, that we know that the demons have become extraordinarily powerful, that's what I'm supposed to do, decent Catholics, turn on the news channel to get that. But you don't even have to hardly see it. But I'll give you a couple of examples that give you an idea. So in exorcism, we have what we call the primary signs of possession, which we'll talk about on Monday, or tomorrow. Those are the primary signs of possession. But then we have what we call the secondary signs of possession. And these are signs that you can see them, they don't necessarily indicate that the person's possessed, but everybody who's possessed often has these. And one of them is mendacity, lying, constant lying. One time I actually had a 3-day session with Satan. One of the few cases I actually thought I was telling the truth. 3 days. Beat the guy brutally for 3 days. It literally would have been done if he just told me the truth, but he didn't for 3 days. He lied to me for 3 straight days. This gives you how bent they are against the truth. The fact that in our culture, you turn on the television and they have been systematically lying to us about certain things for the last 2 years. I'm going into it. We all know what it is. They've been lying to us over and over again. That there's going to be stacking bodies in the streets, and there's this is the worst thing that's ever hit humanity, blah, 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 blah. Showing us pictures of overcrowded hospitals, you find out they were actually in Italy, not in the United States. Or the fact that they were doing, you just go down the whole list of this, right? And they kept lying to us. In fact, right now, I don't even know what's really going on in the Ukraine and in Russia. I don't know what's going on there. You can't get any reliable information. You actually have people in the news media saying, you are not to do the thinking. They've said this, actually out loud, on public air, saying it's our place to determine what you think. They don't want you looking at the truth. They don't want you looking at stuff. The systemic lying, and from our government, the constant lying, it's just, after a while, one of my recommendations is if you want to really make yourself immune to diabolic influence, stop listening to them. You know, when I grew up, there's a thing called integrity. Integrity meant that you never did anything that would be against virtue. Because if you did, if you lied to somebody once, that's it. You didn't trust them. Because you never knew from that point on whether they were going to tell you the truth or not. The only way someone could recoup their integrity is if they spent years and years and years of never lying to you, and you saw that, and you can say, okay, I can trust you to some degree. But when you have an industry that has built its entire industry on systemic lying, why is anyone listening to this? It makes zero sense. Just shut the television off, Frank. Quit listening to them. Because why? It's like listening to the devil. I can't even listen to the thing because I'm just like, oh, no, that's not true. I just go down to reading the actual government statistics. When it gets to the point where you're just, and I'll get off the branch here in a minute. But it's just one of those, after a while, you're just like, one of the ways you're going to protect yourself is quit listening to constant lying, but that's one of the ways you know they're lying. That you know it's diabolic, that the diabolic has crept into virtually every level of our government, and our culture. Another area that you see is, I tell people, we're living in communism in our country. It's just soft. And how do you know that we're living under communism? there's three ways that you know it. Every single communist country has always seen these three things in every single case. The first is a deleterious effect on the material quality of life of the citizen. We're seeing it with these shelves in the store, supply chain problems. That's actually the reason why my vote for decrease is out there, because literally the printers are held to such rigorous standards from paper producers because they can't get the paper produced soon enough that the printers have to indicate to the paper suppliers what the book they're printing and how many pages it is, and that's exactly the amount of paper they're giving these people. And it's just, we're going to see this, and what? The supply chain issues, we're all watching on TV, it's like a train coming down the track, this is not looking good, right? Yeah. Even the government's sitting there, there's going to be food supply problems. And they act like this is just normal. No, this is not normal, it's just a sign of communism. They do this in every place. There's people that were friends of mine, nuns, very holy nuns, they were from Poland. And they said, one of the things you really see among communist countries is that the food shelves will be bare, but the liquor shelves are completely packed. Right? And they do that to bring people down. The second thing you always see is loss of religious freedom for the Catholic Church. The third is death. There has never been a communist regime that took over a country for any length of time in which a sizable portion of their citizenry was not dead before it was all said and done. Okay. So, we know we're living under soft communism because they're lying to us and they're basically constantly trying to manipulate us. But there's another sign too. And by the way, if you want to see how diabolic psychology lines out perfectly with communist psychology, you can just watch a series on YouTube talking about this is how demons think. And it's perfectly mirrored in communist thinking. Right? It's a little bit more hidden to us. But another way that you can actually tell, and this is one of the signs that we know that the battlefield that we're dealing with is that we're really in a battlefield. And it's not just politics. This is a sign that what's going on in politics is diabolic. Well, first of all, just the fact that we've been fighting to get rid of abortion, and every little inch on that has just been a brutal battle to accomplish, tells you there's something diabolic about it. But one of the principal things that you'll see about the demons is what's called malice. Now, malice, St. Thomas defines as the choosing of the lesser good, in which the lesser good is actually evil. So, this is something that, we're not talking about the fact that you can choose between white car or black car, so you choose black car. We're not talking about that. That's about choosing among goods. That's not malice. Malice is when something is really evil, but there's some good thing that you want to get out of it, so you choose that good thing even though it's only apparent good, it's not truly good. In fact, the thing is actually really evil. Right? And so malice is when people choose lesser goods. And so we tend to think of malice as that people are just doing things that are evil. Well, that's true, but the evil is still being done under the aspect of good in their minds. But I'll give you an idea of how you know we're not dealing with just, incompetence, but we're actually dealing with malice. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we elected a president who was a bumbling idiot. I'm not saying just hear me out. Just for the sake of argument. Let's just say we elect a president who's a bumbling idiot. That means that as a bumbling idiot, from time to time, he's going to bumble on the right thing to do, and as a result of that, you're going to get a mixed bag. Okay. I'm not talking about our current president, necessarily. But when you see in government, every single thing they do takes our country down another peg. Literally, everything they do, destroying the energy infrastructure so that we can't ultimately fight a war, taking our military out, making sure that all this wokeness and all this other nonsense is put out there. and constantly chiseling away at the fabric of our society, attacking the family, and constantly promoting abortion. Now some states are even talking about infanticide. Every single thing you do, literally everything they do, maximizes damage within their ability to do it. We are not talking just about the human element. This is diabolic. That's why I said in the homily, if you're seeing it mirrored if you're seeing what's going on in the geopolitical situation, that tells you that same problems in the church away. How do we know this? Let's face it. Let's just be honest with ourselves. There are certain bishops, we know they are, who literally everything that comes out of their mouth is wrong. It's just contrary to the Catholic faith. Everything they do within their dioceses causes damage. They have no vocations. These guys send their seminarians to the worst seminaries instead of some of the best. These guys, everything they do maximizes damage. By the way, you want to know how we know this? The pedophilia problem in the Catholic Church did not begin in the 1960s and 70s. It began in the 40s and 50s when they started letting these guys into the seminaries and didn't root them out. In 1961, there was a document put out by the Vatican called Institutio Religiosorum. At that point, they sent to all the heads of religious communities worldwide, and they said, stop ordaining the homosexuals and the pedophiles. 1961. It's a dead letter, because by that time they had already gotten in. So they let them in the 40s and 50s. You have a 20-year delay. The pedophilia problems peak during the 60s, 70s, and start trailing off in the 80s. That's the pattern to see. What did you see in the civil authorities? They started letting all these people it was like about a 20 or 30-year delay. Now we've got a problem where the problem with pedophilia, we're talking about it. Really, states like California are talking about lowering the age of consent. Why? Because they want to get rid of it. There is a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's used by almost all psychologists to determine whether a person is mentally ill or not. And it breaks all the different mental illnesses down. And most of them use it because that's the only way to be paid by insurance. Right? You got to give a number. So they use that. In the diagnostics, in the DSM-3, homosexuality was listed as a disorder, which they, all by the way, when they say that, well, we don't know where this comes from, they're lying. They know exactly where homosexuality comes from, both in women and in men. There's only 0.5% of the cases of homosexuality that they don't know the cause of. 0.5%. The rest of them they actually know. They also know exactly how to overcome it. But it's professional suicide. The homosexuals got into the APA, American Psychiatric Association, and also the American Psychological Association, and got homosexuality removed from the DSM-3. Why? Because that's the only way you can make it legal. If it's a mental disorder, you cannot make it legal. They are actively working, we're coming up on the DSM-6, they are actively working to get pedophilia removed as a psychological disorder, because once it is, then the courts will allow it publicly. And you're seeing this across the board. We also have pedophilia has gone off the charts, right? Even among some of the, we're hearing it like left about certain politicians and things like this. This stuff is, some of it might be rumor, but some of it is obviously, look, if the church doesn't have its act together, it's not doing, the members of the church aren't becoming holy, they're not fighting the spiritual warfare properly, we're going to get this 20-year delay, and we're going to be smack in the middle of our civil authorities coming after us. That's what's happening. So, quite frankly, I don't really care who we elect as president at this stage. We've got to get our own act together and fight this thing properly. If we do that, this other stuff will follow. We're going to have to suffer for a while. But this other stuff will follow. We become holy, and the grace will come into the world, and people will start, God will give other people actual graces that we merit, and as a result, we'll start thinking clearly, because the principal effect of actual grace is to enlighten the mind and strengthen the will. People will finally start to see the reality of what's going on. As long as Catholics are not leading good Catholic lives, we can't expect anything else. People sit there and say, well, the church sins aren't that bad, really. If you get a chance, you should read a book called The Index of Leading Catholic Indicators. The Catholic Church has declined since 1950 in every single category measurable except for conversions in Africa. Every single number of priests, number of religious, number of seminarians, the number of lay people attending Mass, etc., has been in decline. Then we hear this nonsense, it's new springtime. Oh, what's winter like? But the point being is that the Catholics aren't leading Catholic lives. Statistically, the number of Catholics living together before they get married is only 1% less than the general population, which is 97%. And then, if people are committing all this evil and the demons are being in power, why would we think that we're in the midst of a brutal spiritual war? Right? The fact that we're just unaware of it, and part of the problem is too, is that people can kind of live in their own cocoons, right? Their own family might be really decent, so things seem to be generally fine, but where people usually see it is they'll be raising the kids Catholic, things are fine, and then all of a sudden one of the kids just goes off. Virtually every Catholic family of any size has this. And this is part of the problem, it's a sign that we're dealing with diabolic influence. Talking to people before this, I'll give you an indication of just how pervasive spiritual warfare can actually be. You would think that human love would be like one of the last places that teens really want to get involved. First of all, it's kindness should repulsive to begin with. But I tell people, if you have a son or a daughter that's dating somebody and you don't think that person's a good person, start saying binding person against any demon that's keeping them together. It's like clockwork. Within 3 weeks to a month, once in a while it's a little more than that, the bad person relationship will leave. Demons can actually give people amorous feelings for each other. Now, before you start worrying about your own marriage, just so you know, they can actually give people amorous feelings. And that's what I want. We're going to talk a little bit about the complexion of this, what we're seeing. We're seeing all this stuff. As people become more and more habituated to following their emotions, and the reason I can't hardly watch any mainstream news media. The whole thing is just sappy with emotion from beginning to end. It's either fear or making you feel compassion for someone who just lost her house or whatever. It's right there. Sorry for it. That's not the issue. The issue is when it's just this constant feeding of the emotions. And they're training us to follow our emotions. Why? So that they can manipulate us. That's exactly what demons do. Demons do what we call running commentary. They put stuff in your head, and they pick at it, and they do certain things, and then you can even move your emotions. So what can demons actually affect in us? As I mentioned in the homily, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they did it by eating something, by eating it, and so it was a bodily activity. That meant that they sinned through their bodies, and that means their bodies became subject to diabolical influence. And because we are their children, so does all of ours. So if there's any material aspect of our being, and if that includes some of the faculties, which we'll talk about here in a minute, they can influence them and access them to them, God permitting. It's up to God to determine how much that is the case, in each case. And you have to understand that God adjusts temptations and diabolic influence based upon what the person can handle, but also the virtue that He wants you to achieve. How do we know this? Well, one thing is we know God really likes variety. How do we know that? All you got to do is look at all the different kinds of bugs. He likes a lot of different things. I mean, there's really millions of species of bugs, right? But He likes variety, and that means in heaven, there's only 2 people that have the absolute full plenitude of virtue in heaven. And that's Christ in His humanity and Our Lady. I won't go into it now, but I'll just mention this. Our Lady, in every single thing she ever did, every single thing she ever did, she always chose the most virtuous path, chose virtue. She was building virtue for an entire life, never committing sin to tear it down. That's why she's just at a completely different level than the rest of us. But the rest of us are going to have very different virtues by varying degrees, because God likes, again, that the virtues adore our soul. So when you die, when you take it, these your level of sanctifying grace, which is in your soul, and this level of virtue you have, that's what you take. And that is what makes your soul beautiful, is this indwelling of God in your soul and in all these different virtues. And so the virtue that you find probably the most difficult to achieve is actually the one that God's allowing the demons to tempt you in that area, is actually the one He wants you to become perfect in. Why? Why does He let demons in our lives? He lets them in because, let's face it, all of us are pretty soft spiritually. And quite frankly, if demons weren't there tugging away and beating up on us, we'd all be soft spiritually. We'd have the same motivation. But when they drag us a certain way, or if we fall because of their insight, which by the way, not all temptation comes from demons, some comes from the flesh and the world too. But when they tempt us and if we fall, then we have to fight in our struggle, get back up on our feet. But then when we just endure the temptation, fight the temptation, do the virtuous thing, and call on God and rely on Him for confidence, we start building a level of virtue that you would never attain if demons weren't affecting us. One of the key things to remember is that demons are allowed in our lives primarily. Some of the things we talk about, like St. Alphonsus of Liguori, that sometimes in a secondary way, sometimes God will allow them in people's lives specifically to punish them, to say, well, if this is what you want, there you go. But in most people's lives, He allows the demons in their lives not to punish them, but in order to make them virtuous. The demons are actually the instruments of our sanctification, becoming more virtuous, doing the meritorious act, and therefore becoming more holy through the process. And how much the demons are in your life is generally proportionate, either to your sin, or to how much grace God wants you to have. You know, one of the ways you notice this, have you ever seen these Catholic families that are extraordinarily solid in their belief in what the Catholic Church teaches, and they're very devout, but they're just brutalized. They suffer from all these things. Well, there's why. God's calling them to a level of sanctity that He's probably not calling other people. The degree that God allows demons into your life is sometimes the same degree that He wants you to achieve in sanctity. People who are possessed very often go through what we call something very similar. John the Cross calls it the dark night of the senses, the dark night of the soul, where the demons are battling with them interiorly to such a degree, but the intensity is so brutal that the suffering is at such a level, it's like going through a passive purgation, which is the first stage in the process of becoming a saint. So they come out the other end, and if they battle it well, these are some of the most holy people I've ever met. You can be fully possessed. I'm going to rephrase that. You can be possessed, because full possession is another matter. You can be possessed and still be in the state of grace. There are saints that are possessed. And so that because possession is in the body, demons afflict us in the body, sanctity is in the soul. And so that's why they can coexist with each other. And of course it drives the demons nuts. They just tell them in session, I do this all the time. I force them to admit to the person that they're possessing, who's fighting the battle well, that the demons themselves are becoming an instrument of this person's sanctification, becoming holy through it. And that they're actually gaining a higher place in heaven because of your involvement in their lives, aren't you? And they're like, they hate it. And they'll say, yes, it's true. So, that's why God allows them into our lives. But it doesn't mean that we should sit there and just say, oh, well, then I'll just let it be. No. Our jobs are also, we're the instrument of justice to these guys, so they deserve beating. I'll give you an idea of how much they even know they deserve beating. So one time I had the new devil guy, he's a real guy. Mentioned him Solomon. And he's actually very fascinating because as soon as I found out who he was, I started researching the New Day Devil that follows the church. And they started giving me a description of this guy. So I go into the next session and I said, well, his wife was there. And I started describing, well, this is the guy that possessed you. And afterwards, her mouth was hanging down. I said, well, okay, let's go about that. It's a perfect description of who's possessed. That tells you something which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's called psychological compatibility. Demons spend an enormous amount of time trying to make you into their image. Okay. But, so I find out, by the way, he's also the demon that this is what the fathers say. So when you hear these modern psychologists say, oh, we discovered this thing called midlife crisis. Sorry, you got beat by almost 2,000 years. The fathers of the church refer to the noonday devil as the demon of the midlife crisis. He's also the demon of sloth. Everybody who goes through midlife crisis is because there's some type of spiritual lack of discipline somewhere. Okay. So, this psychological compatibility. First, let's back up. So demons have access to the following faculties. They have access to your imagination, stimulus of the imagination. They have access to your memory. Anything you've ever seen can be taken out, either in part or in whole, and put back in your memory by them. This is why I tell people, never, ever, under any circumstance whatsoever, ever look at pornography. The minute it's there, for the rest of your life, it's a minefield for you. They can use against you. Any sin is the same. So, the point being is that your memory, they can take bits and pieces of memory. They can also, we're not going to go into the whole psychology, you got to buy my book for that. But they can also affect this thing called the cogitative power. It's part of the brain that has the ability to make associations, right? And so our entire advertising industry is based on it, right? So they'll put this scantily clad woman next to the beer, right? So the guy thinks, oh, if I drink the beer, okay, woman, right? So it's that kind of associations that they're building up, which, by the way, you can watch my thing on brainwashing. That ability to make associations and also to disassociate that this thing is like this, or this thing's connected with this, or this thing is not like this. They have been doing it systematically to us for the last 2 years. If you look at the 3 stages of brainwashing, our country just got on to the 3rd stage. Okay. So that being said, the demons can affect this cogitative power. The cogitative power has the ability to make associations. It also has the ability to make assessments of something's good or bad purely on a physical level. So, for example, if someone comes up to me and says, Father, I have the best chocolate you will ever eat. Okay, that's good as world. And now, mind you, I've eaten some of the top chocolate in Switzerland and in Belgium, so I know a good chocolate. Then they bring me a Hershey bar, and I started going, this is okay, this thing is the best. Why? Because my cogitative power, I experience this with my senses, it gets into my imagination, my cogitative power goes back in my memory and compares it to this Belgian chocolate I have that was just off the charts. And I compare it and it says, no, this is not the best. Purely on a physical level, right? But that assessment that this thing is either good or bad is why we have, as I mentioned before, antecedent emotion. What happens is when you have a bad experience, like an emotional experience in the past, that association, this bad thing, gets stored in memory, and then it gets brought back and merged with your image by the cogitative power, so it puts a perspective on the image before you even really have a chance to think about it. And the more intelligent you are, the quicker this happens. Let me give you an example. When a guy is first married, he looks at his wife, and he'll tell you, she is such a loving wife. I love my wife. I love being around my wife. I love everything about my wife. I even like the fact that she talks a lot because I love her voice, etc. By the way, it's true. Okay. After 10 years and lots of memories, she walks into the room, and the first thing that goes to his mind is the old battle. She hasn't even changed. What's changed is your experience of her and these memories and the cogitative power, putting that perspective up here. I'm suffering. But the guys do it to women too. I always tell women, if you want to know why your life is so bitter, just go look in the mirror. Okay, so the demons have the ability to put that perspective on that image in the imagination. This is how they can give people humorous feelings for each other. And that's why I said you got to pray to get these demons out of there. But the other side of it is that they can also, emotions occur in the body, so they can move our emotions at the same time. So they can put something in your image, your imagination, and then move your emotions. And that's how they tempt people. they can put something in your, into your imagination. I tell people, dealing with demons is not that much different. When the internet first came out, forgive the analogy, but when the internet first came out, this was in 1995 that I can remember first taking a look at. There was this game online. The game was, this guy would walk into a bar, and there would be this woman sitting at the bar, and she was just ugly as sin. And your whole goal of the game was to win enough points to buy the beer to get to the point where she would start getting better looking after every beer. Okay. That's exactly how demons work with us. They can put the perspective on things that we would never possibly imagine that we would be attracted to that can make it attractive. I tell exorcists all the time when I'm training them, look, your first year as an exorcist, don't call me. Unless it's a question about your case. If it's because you're experiencing this, get in line. It's literally, they will test and probe every single depravity, inclination to sin, every disorder imaginable to the exorcist in the first couple of years to find out where is he at. And they do the same thing with other people too, right? They do just different ways. You have to remember too, the demons have been watching you since you were in the womb. They can simply look at your DNA and know what your disposition is, and therefore what your proclivities are, just by looking at your DNA. That's how knowledgeable they are about us. They also have been watching you, so they know the sins that you committed, they know what your tendencies are, and so that's why they just keep feeding those tendencies. And this is the complexion that we're dealing with. This is kind of the battlefield. But what do demons do? Demons test in a very specific way. We'll end with this and then go to the Q&A. Demons test in a very structured fashion. First of all, they've been watching this. They know when to come on strong, when not to come on strong. They know, for example, that the wife is likely to react negatively because she's been hurt her husband, and so she'll press those buttons whenever that happens to make her feel more hurt than she actually is, or contrary to his actual intentions, or vice versa. It can happen both ways. They can, so when their structure that they're doing, what they're trying to build up is this. The primary weakness of every single demon is his sin. If you can find out, so if any case that protracts, one of the things we do is we beat out what we damned for. What was the sin? And you just ask what's your assigned task and you invert that. Because then what happens is, because they rejected God and rejected their assigned task, they actually do everything contrary to that task now. So for example, the demon Isis, yes, there is a demon named Isis, who's an Egyptian, who became idolized by the Egyptians. It's actually his sin is that he refused to accept the mercy that God would have for human beings. And why does God have mercy for us? Because we're dumb. We really are. And I was like, okay, extremely embarrassing. And that's why it was the demons, they knew better. There's no excuse. There's human beings, we're pretty clueless. Right? And we seem to be getting dumber by the day. But the point being is that the demons, their weakness is their sin. Because when they chose that, that's the thing they became attached to. And it's the thing that their will is locked in. When demons made a choice, because they had absolutely perfect intellectual clarity of the choice that they had, when they made that choice of their will, they were all in. It was either all for God or it was all for themselves. And so they became perfectly locked in that thing. And their will became completely fixed. Human beings will become fixed too, but it's by degree over the course of time. So, what they do is, because that's their weakness, it's hard for them to, but they also want to inspire people to commit that same kind of sin, so that they get this replication of this imagery in other people. See, demons have this idea that there's a certain kind of glory that you get out of people being like them, right? Because the people in hell, you see that all the angels in hell, they see these other demons mimicking this and people becoming like that, and they think there's this kind of glory in it, right? But in point of fact, the demons will actually admit their shame. Oh, well, that's a topic for another time. But they're weak in relationship because they can't think outside that box. But what they do is they start tempting you in that area. If they find any resistance, it's hard for them to fight that, right? So what they do is they start manipulating you through temptation and through sin, and they get these habitual sins and defects into your life, and they're doing this on a consistent and regular basis because they're trying to form that cogitative power and your judgments of the other part of your intellect, which is immature, which makes it has a power of judgment, trying to get into certain habits of thinking and getting into certain habits of choice and things like that, so that they start to become easier to move and more pliable. And so they're slowly building up that psychological compatibility between you and them. They want to make you into the little images of themselves, even in your own patterns of thinking. This is why, even in marriage, I don't care how evil your spouse is, you have to start looking at it from a different point of view. Otherwise, the demons are just going to take you and your marriage to hell. Point being in all of this is that that's one of the principal ways that you can see in your own self that this is a spiritual battle. If there's any habitual part of your spiritual life that is a defect, or that you fall into venial sin and type of that means you have psychological compatibility with some demon that inspires that. You don't want that. It sounds kind of repulsive, frankly, to be in league with the demon, so to speak. But they're doing this in relationship to the person's psychological compatibility. Then I'll end with this. In possession, if the case protracts for any length of time, there's 6 stages of liberation. You can actually tell where the person is in those stages of liberation, getting close to liberation, by how much psychological separation they get from the demon. Once the person gets that psychological, that they're no longer compatible with the demon, because the demons have been driving this for years in these people's lives for a long time. Once they gain that psychological separation, liberation is fairly close behind. But until then, they're not going to get liberated. And this is one of the reasons why you've got to really, and how do we get that? Well, St. Thomas says that faith is the first purification of the intellect. The first thing you're going to do to purify your mind, make it less compatible with demons, is to learn your faith. I'll talk about that more as we go on Monday. And I think we're going to have Q&A, so if you have a question, I think probably the standard thing is raise your hand. Don't ask the question until the mic gets to you. We'll give you a connection.
Have you found that Harry Potter has been an opening for the demonic in people's lives?
There's always something like stuff.
What I'm going to tell you is not my opinion. I'll give you my opinion at the end. What I'm about to relate to you is an experience. Mine and other exorcists. I want you to understand this is not an opinion of mine. This is what other exorcists have experienced. I knew a woman who became possessed with 5 demons who claimed that they inspired J.K. Rowling to write Harry Potter, and how they got in, she, contrary to our recommendation, allowed her children just to watch Harry Potter. One of the exorcists, who was probably one of the best worldwide until his health got or he could continue it, had to exorcise 3 children just for reading Harry Potter. Bonafide witches, say that the actual spells in there are real. Now, people have tried to debunk that, but I'm sorry, but this is, yeah, I'm not looking at it. If she's a witch, I'm gonna take her word for it, right? The second, so there's that. The second component is, in the books of Harry Potter, is a complete violation of what's called the principle of the integral good, which basically means this. In order for an action to be morally good, the end, that is your intention, what you're doing, and the circumstances in which you do it, must all be good. If any one of those is bad, the whole act is rendered bad. This is the principle upon which we reject the idea that the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means is the total theme through all of the Harry Potter's writings. That being said, I've seen a lot of collateral damage. Another observation that exorcists have noticed. If I were to say to everybody, maybe we should really wait until people get to college before they read the book Catcher in the Rye, because there's some stuff in there that really people need to be over in order to process. Most people would sit down and have a reasonable discussion with you. The minute you mention, maybe your kids should be reading Harry Potter, the visceral attack you get is completely disproportionate to this. You know why I have trifocals? I went through a program in college where we had to read a book per week per class. I had 5 classes. I've read a boatload of literature, and I can tell you right now, Harry Potter is some of the poorest literature out there. The fact that this thing has a meteoric rise is baffling because it's some of the poorest written literature I've ever read. And I had to do it to review it for this stuff. Okay. So, now my opinion. I tell people stay away from it. I've just seen too much damage, and my personal opinion is that the thing is diabolical. By the way, J.K. Rowling admits that the thing was actually done by channeling. She said all 7 volumes, in all their parts and in all their details, came into her mind at once, instantaneously. That is not how people think. Tolkien took 30 years to write The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. 30 years of development to produce that. You don't come up with everything all at once. That's what demons do. That's how demons give people information. Okay, so that's just my opinion. I tell people stay away from it. Get it out of your house. If you got it in your house, get it out. As you can see, I'm really hot in Harry Potter. Yes.
It's a little discouraging to hear how smart the demons are and how manipulated we can be through so many different ways. And then even more discouraging to hear how dumb we are. And I have that, experience in my own life as well. But I'm reminded of St. Teresa's childlike faith and just asking the Lord to protect us and fight for us. I know that there's a lot that we can do as well, and I'm sure you're going to cover some of those things, but I get a little anxious when I start hearing some of those things, and I just wanted you to kind of speak to some of the ways that we can, just on a day-to-day basis, be aware of these things, not too aware, and what we can do.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. My intention is not to depress everybody. Even in cases of possession, or in spiritual warfare in general, there is one element that we enjoy as human beings, which is such a random wild card for demons that they are always afraid of us. It's grace, actual grace. Christ will give people graces to see, because again, it lightens the mind and strengthens will. When they see, and in fact, there's times when you can probe in graces. They can actually tell by watching somebody long enough if they have graces of vocation, the priesthood or something. And that's why a lot of times those people go off the rails. But it's grace. It's dependent on grace primarily. It's our Catholic faith too, but it's the grace that is the unknown factor. Even during a session when you're doing exorcisms, clients will just all of a sudden get this inspiration. I need to ask about this. And you'll ask about it, all of a sudden they look at you like they have been hiding it. The demons have been hiding it. I get this one case that's been going on. For a time they had been hiding this one thing that was so obvious. I tell people, look at it. I'm pretty slow on the uptake, really. Because if it takes me 14 years to ask a particular question that I should have asked 13 years ago, I'm pretty thick, frankly. But that's how we all are in spiritual life. In a spiritual battle, we're all pretty dumb, frankly. But it's grace. I got this grace to see, I didn't ask about this last time, boom, I got the case. It's the same thing in our own spiritual lives. So God, if we rely on grace, and this is the key thing. One of the principal ways to fight spiritual warfare is absolute, absolute fidelity to grace. When God gives you an actual grace, you follow it. If He gives you grace to go pray, you follow it. If He gives you grace to fly or do whatever things, you follow it. And you keep leading your life going from grace to grace, as they say, St. Paul said. But this is the thing, you want to make sure that you're absolutely faithful to grace. And if you do that, the demons are far more afraid of you than we are of them. Yeah, demons know what they're done. And they teach you like you're done in session. It's okay. I admit I'm done. There's one woman, this is one of the most fantastic ones. The demons hated this woman so bad, they would never use her name. They were just referred to as that stupid woman, right? So at one point, they talked to her, they referred to her, they said, "You're that stupid woman." And she turned to them and like, "This is Grace Inaugural. This is Grace Inaugural, right here." She turned to them and she said, "I might be stupid, but at least I'm not foolish." Shut up. They left her alone for a couple of days. Right? The point being is that God can give us the grace to do just the right thing at the right time, so it's that absolute failure to grace. Plus, there's a whole series of things that we can do to keep ourselves protected. And the good news is, we don't have to be geniuses in this life or like spiritual warfare. I tell people I have 6 academic degrees. What's so hilarious is my parents are going to like, "Can you do something if like this?" But I have 6 academic degrees, and there has not been a single case I've ever solved with anything I've learned academic. It's always been through grace. And people say, "Oh, Father, you're an expert on exorcism." There's no such thing. Yes, it's true that I've studied the patterns, I've studied the authors throughout history, I've done a lot of research, I've written books on the thing, and this, I tell people, these are the set of parameters that the church has always taught, and this is how exorcists stay within the parameters, etc. That's true, that I can give you that, but every time I walk into a new case, I know nothing about it, other than there's these set of parameters that I operate within, because this is what the church has always told me to do, and I stay in my lane, and then I'm safe. So when you get outside your lane, that's when the trouble starts. I just do what I'm supposed to do, and then at a certain point, I walk into the case. I don't know who the demons are necessarily. I don't know how they got in. I don't know what's going to get them out a lot of times. I don't know all sorts of the dynamics. In fact, what happens is it's kind of an interesting thing in possession when you first start doing the exorcisms, and the demon manifests preternaturally, which we'll talk about what that means. They manifest. That is a key time because they're going to be blabbing, they're going to be singing like a canary. They're going to tell you all sorts of stuff. And you're not going to understand any of it. But as the case starts to grind to a law, what happens is when you sufficiently get to the last stage, stage 5 or 4, it's called the ascension phase. When you get into that phase, all these things they've been telling you for years in this case start to coalesce. It's like the demon's like, "Oh, you want to know?" And then he throws you this puzzle that breaks out into 1,000 pieces. You look like, "I don't know what I'm looking at." But you start putting it together over the course of time. By the time you get done, it all comes together, right? The point I'm drawing out is that in every case, that's what I experience. I don't know. I mean, okay, so I know certain things theologically and philosophically, but I don't know what's going on in the case. So every single case is new. Every single case is stuff there's stuff you discover about demons. Oh, yeah, let's see. How do you even come up with that? That's what you think to yourself. But the point being is that you don't have to be a genius. You just have to be living a good Catholic faith and living a life according to grace, and virtually grace, especially. Being faithful to grace. And that is what fear you. When you step into the, you see in Hollywood, they always show these, the exorcist gets in there and it's all famous. It's the exact opposite. In fact, I always tell people, Tony probably say this all the time. When you step into, especially if you're an experienced exorcist, the demons know that you know what you're doing. When you're first an exorcist, they're like little kids testing the probe, you can see what you can do. Right? But when you're an experienced exorcist, when you step in, they are scared to death. And they hide it to the degree that they can, but they are scared to death. And the reason being is because they know that as long as I stay in my lane, they are going to get a brutal beating. So brutal, in fact, that by the time you get to the end of stage 5, the pain that they are in is so severe that they would rather be in hell than in possession. That's how bad it is. Now, literally, there's 4 stages in stage 5, and then there's the stage that's penultimate. The penultimate stage is they go to God and they bargain. They're in so much pain that they go to God and let me out. That's how bad it is. So what does this mean? It just means that you don't have to know these things. And the demons are not, they're more afraid of us. If you're leading a good, holy Catholic life, and you're doing what first of all, they've already been humiliated by you if you've been leading a good Catholic life all through your life. So they just know if God tells them, okay, you gotta go deal with this person again, they're like, okay, they're constricted, just like we are. And so they go and they fight the thing, and then they get humiliated, and they go back down to hell, and everybody ridicules them. In fact, I even said that to Satan. They all laugh behind your back, don't they? When you're down to hell. No, they don't. Yeah, I think they do. No, they don't. Yeah, they do. Then they're just like, yeah, they do. So the point being is that we shouldn't be afraid. Christ said, I remember how many times, like 53 times, he said, don't be afraid in the scriptures. The don't be afraid appears 257 times, I think, in scripture. We shouldn't be afraid. In fact, Satan, maybe I'll go to this later, Satan is at root, a demon. Fear, first and foremost. And so I tell you, don't be afraid. As long as you're standing, as long as you're doing what you need to do, stay in the state of grace, and complete faith with grace, and doing the things that you need to do, there's nothing to be afraid of. If they do get in your life, well, then you just deal with them, use it as an opportunity to grow in holiness, and then if worse comes to worse, you do the same Teresa of Avila did when she looked up and Satan was hovering above her, she listens to you again and just goes back to sleep.
Father, let's do one more question, if we may. Okay.
So, the practical application of this, there are certain things I think you can do, when you're being tempted, maybe using holy water, epiphany water, saying the names of the Holy Family to try and, I guess, deter them from attacking you. And it ranges from the level of superstitious, where you're just doing it without the right intentions, to a dryness where you feel like you're doing something rote, but you're doing it piously, and then having the maximum intention possible. So what are some practical applications, ways we can move along that scale, would you say?
On Monday night, I'll talk all about
All right, maybe one more. Just do one more.
that's actually what I want to get into on Monday.
Father, with autism, is there a connection between demonic affliction, or is that all just a medical diagnosis and situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of the stuff that you see with people are autistic, depending on what level of spectrum they're on. Depending on whether at the spectrum, you can see everything from, kids are very minded. Sometimes the stuff that seems almost diabolic in nature. One time, I had this lay assistant who's extraordinary. He's been helping exorcists for almost 25 years. And so we were looking at this one case. They had this woman had this kid who was autistic. He was generally pretty good, but all of a sudden he just started getting really mean. And he kept sticking his hand in his mouth. And I told her, I said, well, I'm willing to pray with the kid, but I've prayed over a lot of those kinds of kids, and I've never seen any significant shit. I think God actually does protect them because they're diminished capacities. And so I just have never seen kids with autism that are even extraordinary diabolical disaster or anything like that. I said, well, prayer one way, just kind of looked at me and says, take him to a dentist. He takes him to the dentist. And the next day he's got access to pull it out, get his glasses. My point is that most of those things, we know the psychological patterns from psychology, but then also we know that the patterns that you're likely to see something autistic depending on where they're at on the spectrum. And so as a result of that, our experience is that by and large they are not diabolically influenced. And if they are, it's just worse. It's just little stuff here and there depending on their capacity.
All right. Well, I want to thank Father again for being here. It's been a wonderful evening. I want to thank all of you. I also want to thank Kathleen Moore, who's my director of parish life, which is a big catch-all title, and she does, the event planning and organizing things, along with my staff, of course. It's kind of all hands on deck. But I want to thank Kathleen. It was just really well done. So. I'm sorry?
Final blessing.
Yes.
Ben, sorry. Ben takes the day off.